Today's lecture is titled Boats and Barbells, Special Considerations for Strength Training Rowers. So to start, a brief sport overview. There are typically three types of racing. 2 kilometer course race, side-by-side or lane racing is most common. Typically in the fall season, we'll see long distance course races or more head racing, pretty much being where one athlete will proceed down the course. Different intervals, we'll see athletes being cued to keep going down. They just go by individual time. And erg racing, typically being done in the more winter months indoors on a rowing ergometer. There are two weight classes, both for men and women, lightweight and heavyweight. Lightweight being less than 160 pounds for men, lightweight for women being less than 130 pounds, and heavyweight being no limit. There are also two forms of rowing, both sculling and sweeping. Sculling being 2 oars per one rower, and sweeping being 1 oar per rower, either on the starboard or port side of the boat. And of course, a multitude of event types. Singles, doubles, fours, eights, cocks, and coxless. Again, you can see where the combination may come from depending on the event in the regatta. All right. So a quick seasonal overview. So we'll look at it from January to December, typical 12 months in a year. Blue being winter, pink being spring, yellow being summer, and orange being fall. And we'll kind of start in the middle here with 2 kilometer water season or lane racing. So we'll see this 2 kilometer water season kind of kick off end of March or beginning of April, kind of about the midpoint of spring, and that'll proceed all the way until end of summer or end of August. Once that point hits, we transition more into long distance water season or head racing. That typically starts beginning of September and goes to about end of October, beginning of November. And right around mid-November, end of fall, beginning of winter, you'll see more erg racing where we have the ergometers indoors, and that season will last typically until end of winter, beginning of spring, around mid-end of March. And of course, 2K water season kicks off all over again. Just want to highlight a couple major competitions, both on the Canadian side and international side. So we'll go left to right. Canadian Erg Championships typically happen end of January, beginning of February. Ontario Ergs will happen end of February, beginning of March. The Royal Henley overseas typically happens end of June. The Canadian Henley Regatta end of July, beginning of August. And of course, the World Championships are usually held end of August, beginning of September. And then in the fall season, we'll see the Head of Charles Regatta or the head race end of October in Massachusetts. Quick movement breakdown for the sport. There are 4 phases when doing a rowing stroke. And again, we'll use the example on an erg for easy reference. The catch phase being when the oars are about to enter the water. We'll see that the rowing athlete is in the ready position to start the drive phase. And that's image number 2. From the drive, where we extend the hips and knees, we'll go to the finish, which is labeled number 3, where our arms and shoulders will, carry the force from the stroke. And the recovery phase, we're trying to pat the rower go back into the catch phase with the oars out of the water and getting ready to get back into the drive position. So typical sport demands. We'll look at it from 2 spectrums, both from an energy system demands and from the strength and power demands. So in the image on the left, we see a spectrum going from aerobic, lactic, and alactic energy systems. Typically, we'll have most rowers more towards the aerobic side of things, where we can see the yellow star there. This is not to say that this is always the case, but again, in terms of the spectrum, we'll put our rowing athletes there, and we'll talk about the other side of that coin a couple of slides up. On the strength and power side, of course, they're mostly endurance athletes. Again, you can see where the gold star is there in terms of the spectrum of endurance, strength, and speed. Again, this is not always the case. We'll dive into filling those gaps a little bit later. This just gives us a general overview of the rowing athlete's demands in general. So we have 2 charts here. These are some common sport standards that we can go by. Now, this is just objective criteria that gives us a better indicator of how to gauge our rowing athletes. So on the left, these standards are all taken from the U.S. national team. These are some common 2 kilometer ergometer standards, both for men and women, lightweight, heavyweight, and of course different age categories, junior or U19, under 23, and then senior. On the right, we'll see common wattage standards or power scores from a 60-second modified wind gate at the highest drag factor, both lightweight, heavyweight for men and women. You can see peak power and average power ranges. Now, something to keep in mind is that these standards will not always dictate performance on the water, right? These are just some objective criteria that we can help rank our athletes and give them points to work on and maybe strive for in the future. It's also important to note that anaerobic threshold and peak power were the strongest predictors of on-water performance for a 2 kilometer lane race. And we'll kind of dive into that a bit in the coming slides as well, but it's just important to kind of put that out there now and as we talk about it in the future. So we're going to break it down anatomically now. We'll go from bottom to top. We just want to get a couple definitions out there because we'll talk about force a lot in this slide here. So we break it down as a force potentiator, a force transmitter, a force generator, and a force carrier. So what we mean by a force potentiator is that the joint is responsible for dictating how much force is generated further up the chain. We're talking about force transmitter. That joint is responsible for the transmission of force both ascending and descending down the chain. It doesn't really dictate the force being generated or carried upwards. It just is responsible for passing it through. We talk about a force generated. That is pretty much the engine. That's where we kind of get all the force, where it comes from. And when we talk about a force carrier, it's responsible for the finish, again, in this particular case, pertaining to a rowing stroke. So we'll start at the foot, the ankle. This is a force potentiator / transmitter, relatively mobile joint. What we mean by potentiator and transmitter is that it is responsible for both ascending and descending forces up and down the chain, but it also dictates the potential for the hips to generate their force. So, for example, the greater angle of dorsiflexion our foot can produce leads to a greater knee angle, which in turn leads to a greater hip and allows for more force to be generated. So we work our way up the chain. The knee is a force potentiator, right? The knee angle will dictate the potential force being generated by the hips. If we work up the chain, the hips itself are the force generator. And of course, you'll see some common overuse injuries, being hip flexor or bursitis. We work our way up the chain, we'll see the lower back is a relatively stable joint and is responsible for force transmission. Again, as I talked about, that means it's responsible for bearing force both ascending and descending up the chain, right? So if our lower back is relatively stable, our thoracic would be relatively mobile. And this, of course, is also responsible for force transmission. Common overuse injuries being stress fractures, and we'll talk about joint issues in a second. Elbow and wrist, they are a force carrier, meaning that they are responsible for the finish of the stroke. They're relatively mobile, and of course, some overuse injuries might be minor wrist strains or sprains, depending on how they hold the oar. Finally, finishing off with the shoulder, that's more of a force transmitter responsible for both ascending and descending forces down the curve. Relatively stable joint, of course, overuse injuries may also be prominent. Now, joint issues may cause one of two things, right? First would be down regulation. Now, why is this important? Well, if a joint can't handle a certain amount of force, the brain will naturally slow itself down. So, for example, if we look at a sprinter, for example, if the hip can generate X amount of force, but the foot or the ankle can only handle Y amount of force, right? The brain will naturally slow itself down. Essentially, it's like driving a Ferrari with flat tires, right? And this, of course, is a safety mechanism that we use to prevent injury. Now, the second thing that joint issue may cause, number two, is just injury in general. As you can see, we'll use the thoracic joint as an example, right? Stress fractures are very common in rowers, especially those that sweep to one side, right? If the thoracic area is not strong enough to handle the force being transmitted up and down the chain, either it downregulates or something will eventually have to give. In this case, it's usually the ribs. All right, so just again, a brief anatomical breakdown that we want to kind of keep in mind joint by joint analyses when examining and programming for our rowing athletes. So some special strength training considerations. Our focus, first and foremost, should always be to reduce chronic overuse injuries. And of course, we use that previous slide, joint by joint analyses, to kind of help guide our program in that respect. Again, if we can keep our athletes healthier longer on the water, then we're winning. Second thing we want to do is also balance structure. For example, those rowing athletes sweep on one side only, right? There may be some deficits on the other side of their body. We want to kind of account for that and accommodate for them as well. The next two things we want to do are account for explosive strength and, of course, developing the posterior chain. As I mentioned before, a lot of overuse injuries occur in the lower back area, so we want to make sure that we put that at the forefront of our programming as well. And, of course, these two things combined together will always improve the stroke force and frequency of our rowing athlete. And last, we're going to finish up. We want to make sure that we fill in the gaps of our individual rowing athlete, because as we know, weakness will cause downregulation. If we want to maximize the potential, we want to make sure we kind of narrow that gap. So what's our role as strength coaches? So these two spectrums we put on a previous slide, embody the sport demands of the rowing athlete. Typically, as you can see, the gold star being more aerobic, and on strength and power spectrum, you can see it's more endurance based. So our role is to fill in the gaps, right? So if we can fill in the gaps, we can better supplement the performance demands. And as I mentioned previously, remember that anaerobic threshold and peak power are the strongest indicators of a 2-kilometer lane race performance. So while they're focusing on their aerobic and endurance demands, we can fill in the gaps in the weight room, accommodating and knowing that the lactic threshold and the peak power are the strongest indicators. We can work on those things in the weight room with effective programming. So we'll go over like a sample macro cycle just to give you guys an example we're talking about here. So we've taken a snippet from the seasonal demands, right? So we'll look at May, beginning of May until about end of July, leading up to the Canadian Helen Regatta. Of course, this is 2-kilometer water season, right? We'll break it down in a 12-week macro cycle, the goal being dynamic effort. We use a typical block periodization approach here, going from week 1 through week 12. And you can see 4 different mesocycles with the respective goals, percentages, total volumes, and set reps examples. Okay, so this kind of gives us, again, a funneled approach going from top to bottom, just a better idea and picture of where we kind of want to guide our athletes in the weight room in season leading up to this particular event. Break it down even further, so we'll look at a small snippet from Mesocycle 2, the goal being power weeks 4, 5, and 6 with the respective intensities and volumes written there. This is potentially what a 2-day program in season may look like for one of our rowing athletes, right? So if you start in the prep work area, you can see that we're accommodating for a lot of potential weak points from our joint by joint analysis, right? Whether it be ankles, hips, rotator cuffs. You can see our general prep accommodates for their, with calf raises, and we're preparing them obviously for the explosive movements ahead in their specific prep. Working our way down the chain, you can see our first priority is going to be something explosive, as it might be a hang high pull, or on day 2 a hang jump shrug. And of course, we just kind of work down the chain, box squats and deadlifts using accommodating resistance with respective intensities and volumes, going to our upper body work. And of course, we're always going down the chain, we're finishing up with more posterior chain development. So again, context will always be key when we're talking about that kind of stuff, but that just might be a good sample example of what we're talking about. So some final thoughts. Intent is everything, context is key. As I mentioned previously, that sample macro and sample mesocycle is just a potential idea of what we may program for one of our rowing athletes. Of course, we didn't talk about training age, limitations, abilities, that kind of thing. That'll be your job as a strength and conditioning coach to relate that to your athletes. So our second point here is it's our job to accommodate relative weak links in our athlete's relative chain. So for example, we want to count for those individual weak points. So we can use fat grips to accommodate for their wrist. We can add rotation or anti-rotation trunk work. We can add wedges for their ankles if we're doing squats. Again, these are just a couple examples that we can help individualize athletes' programming that's pertinent to common issues in rowing athletes. We also want to keep in mind seasonal demands. Because they're on the water 3 hours a day in season, we always want to make sure we're giving them the most minimal effective dose necessary to improve performance. So we'd rather undershoot than overkill, right? And of course, this is important for recovery, because as we know, it's not what you do that matters, it's what you can recover from. And lastly, we always want to make sure we're filling in the gaps, supplement what they're already getting. We know our athletes on the water for long durations of time. They don't necessarily need more aerobic work throughout the season because they're getting plenty of that on the water with their sport coaches. Our job is to fill in those gaps, especially that we know that the anaerobic lactic threshold and peak power are such strong indicators of performance, and those are things that we can work on in the weight room to make our athletes that much better on the water. That's it for this lecture, guys. As always, if you have any questions, you can reach out to us via email, info@ironperformance.ca, or follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Click the subscribe button to our YouTube channel for the latest and greatest in strength conditioning. Until next time, guys, take care.